Hi, Eric.
Hi, Bob.
How you doing?
I'm doing okay. How are you?
Can't complain. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright, publisher of the Nonzero newsletter, which I encourage everyone to subscribe to. And you are Eric Levitz, and this is the Nonzero podcast. You are a senior correspondent at Vox. Before that, you were a columnist at New York Magazine. I've always been impressed by your work, and that certainly includes the work that led me to ask you if you wanted to come on the podcast, which is the work you've been doing on the whole Biden mess. I think you've been particularly astute in your analysis and also particularly acute in analyzing the things Biden has been saying and kind of particularly dogged in like paying attention to what he's been saying since the famously disastrous debate and pointing out how bad that stuff has been, which not everyone has been doing. I mean, including you're pointing out that his first extended answer in the Stephanopoulos interview was incoherent. And I want to get back to that and the quality of his rhetoric generally. But first, today he staged a big rebound, at least on the betting markets. I think this morning his chances of being the nominee were well below 50%. Now they're above 60%. You've probably been paying more attention to this than I have. What's the apparent explanation?
Yeah, well, I guess my impression was that over the weekend, the prediction markets, certainly by Sunday, were underestimating his odds. I think that there was a lot of, I mean, basically what we've seen since the debate in general and over the weekend is that there are a lot of really ominous quotes from anonymous Democrats about how it's only a matter of time. We have a mad king. This is going to be sorted out. No one thinks this is tenable, but it's almost always anonymous or rather than being directed, someone speaking it on the record in public or directly to Biden's face. And we have a lot of media stories, but not a ton of people sticking their necks out and actually doing the courageous thing here. It's not that there's been no people in that situation. We've had, I think, about a dozen House Democrats, maybe more today.
Yeah.
Um,
Well,
and
I didn't know there were that many who were actually on the record. I mean, a number of leading House Democrats were anonymously reported to have said on this private conference call Sunday that they thought he should go. But I don't know. I didn't know it was more than 4 or 5 or so on the record. But
yeah, four
anyway.
came out after the meeting
Oh, did
yesterday,
they?
and
Oh,
I think
okay, good.
that there had already been a few that were on. I think NBC News reported nearly a dozen at
Hmm.
that point had said that he should step aside. But yeah, I think that at the same time, we've seen a variety of Democratic leaders, kind of across the ideological spectrum as well, um, either endorse Joe Biden staying on the ticket, really, um, you know, unequivocally, or else saying that this is his decision and really not taking a committal position. I think
Hmm.
that, especially in the Senate, that seems to be a popular position. I think, Bernie Sanders, Tim Kaine, Maggie Hassan, a long list of senators have voiced varying levels of support for Biden's ongoing candidacy. And so, yeah, I just think that every day that goes by since the debate where we don't see Chuck Schumer, Hakeem Jeffries, and a huge group of Democratic lawmakers coming out and saying Biden needs to go, the probability that he rides this out and becomes the nominee goes up. So I'm not surprised by where the prediction markets are at this
Yeah.
point.
Now, there were a couple of things that happened today, I think, that may account for why bettors who didn't agree with you yesterday agree with you today. The So the chair of the Black Caucus came out, I think, in Stephen Horsford, representatives, chair of the congressional, said he's standing behind President Joe Biden. And then Biden did this very, kind of vigorous insistence on Morning Joe this morning that he ain't going anywhere, and kind of said, look, you want to challenge me? Come to the convention. Well, if it gets to that point, of course, he has an advantage, which is a ton of delegates who are pledged to him if he doesn't release them. But I guess the strength of his conviction came through or something. Now, as you pointed out, even on Morning Joe, where he didn't appear, he was calling in and could have referred to notes if he wanted to. Even there, he lost his train of thought. I mean, what he let's see. I'll just read. He says he's talking about Trump, and he says, "Here's a guy who says 10% of universe. I don't want to get into it," and then moves on. That's a little thing. There was I think significantly worse stuff in the Stephanopoulos interview. But the point is, it seems to me every time he says anything that's not directly off a teleprompter, it should reinforce exactly the doubts that were raised by the debate, but that's not quite the way it's being depicted, which isn't to say the media is on his side. In a lot of ways, they've declared a war on him, but they're not like dissecting these things he says like the way I've seen you do, for example.
Yeah, I mean, in my view, the case for his candidacy has gotten significantly worse since the end of the debate. I mean, I personally found his performance at the debate by itself dispositive, but there was a sense afterwards with a lot of Democrats saying things along the lines of, okay, Biden's really needs to go out there and now prove, that this was just an aberration, a bad night, demonstrate his mental acuity, do lots of interviews, lots of press conferences, a full court press in the media. And instead, we saw him keep a pretty low profile outside of teleprompter speeches for several days, do 2 radio interviews in which we later learned they had previously, they cleared what the questions were going to be before the interviews, and in fact wrote the questions themselves.
And by the way, one of those radio hosts has been fired for that. It was deemed a breach of journalistic ethics. A radio personality in Philadelphia. Go ahead.
Yeah, and then one 22-minute sit-down interview that he took a full week to prepare for and did not do very well. In fact, I think was incoherent to begin with, and then I don't know, I think just unappealingly kind of Trumpian by the end of it in terms of just, talking about how, no one else could possibly hold NATO together, to do this and that he alone can fix it kind of message. And just generally sounded delusional about his election odds, dismissed the significant polling suggesting that he is unpopular and is losing to Trump. So yeah, just not a very strong performance. And then today, as you said, he called in to Morning Joe, significantly not appearing on it even virtually, but calling in, which allows you to read from notes. And he did refer to, at one point, reading from a list of Trump's lies. And even apparently with notes in front of him, he, on more than once, lost his train of thought in the middle of a sentence and just kind of abandoned what he was saying. And this seemed to happen especially when he was trying to land a punch on Trump. He wasn't very effective at that. And so, I think reporter for Semaphore, Benji Sarlin, I believe, was the one who put it this way, that basically Biden has not been making much progress in persuading Democrats on the Hill that he is their best candidate and that he should run, but he is persuading them that if they try to take him out, it'll be a murder-suicide, that Biden is signaling like he is going to make this extremely difficult and painful. And that's what's coming through, not coherence, but just the strength of his determination is beginning, I think, to intimidate some Democrats. he's taken to especially framing it in populist terms, that the elites and, out of touch media journalists are trying to push me out, but the people voted for me, and, the Democratic base, the black voters, the black caucus, labor is in my corner, and we're not going to listen to these pointy-headed elites who, think that I don't talk well. That's the line that he's been playing with the past 24 hours. And yeah, I don't know exactly how persuaded people are by this. There's been reports that, the overwhelming opinion among senators and House Democrats is that they would wish that he would step aside. But whether people are willing to stick their necks out, get into this big fight with the president, risk that you do this and he still holds on, so all you've done is damaged your party standing further. And then, if he does pull out, if you do successfully push him off, then you potentially own the consequences of whatever happens in November. Maybe you get blamed for it, whereas Biden currently stands to get blamed for it. And I think that informing all of this in part is widespread lack of confidence in Kamala Harris, so that people reason, well, maybe we have a better chance without Biden, but even then, maybe we don't have a good chance because they don't trust Kamala, and so why stick my neck out? So I think that it's a combination of those things, and it remains to be seen whether that stuff ultimately matters more than the feeling almost unanimous among those in swing districts, in tough Senate races, that Biden is an anchor around their necks.
Yeah. Yeah, it is kind of you mentioned murder-suicide. It is kind of a mutually assured destruction situation in game theoretical terms. I mean, the House, people in the House and the Senate have the capacity to blow themselves up and Biden up. Assuming he remains obstinate. On the other hand, if they threaten to do that, if they start escalating the rhetoric as if they're prepared to do that, that might lead him to abandon his position. Well, you're saying this so far, that's the game he's playing, and they're kind of chickening out. But if the polls get much worse, and I don't particularly expect them to, but the worse the polls make it look for the people in Congress, the more logic would seem to make them willing to go ahead and play the mutually assured destruction game. At least those are who are up for re-election, which includes everyone in the House and 1/3 of the senators. And so, I don't know. Of course, this has to happen fast if it's gonna, if it's gonna happen before the convention. But that's one thing I'd pay attention to, is the more convinced they become that he is fatal to their chances, the more you may expect them to go ahead and say, screw it, and speak out. I mean, we'll see.
Yeah, I mean, there's going to be more polling this week. There's going to be the press conference this week. And I think I read there's like a DCC, one of the Democratic campaign committees is meeting with, I think it's the House caucus, and specifically sent out a thing with, no cell phones allowed in this meeting, basically really emphasizing that they're having a meeting that they really don't want stuff to leak from. And so there's going to be more meetings like that.
That's when
I think it's
happening?
Tomorrow. I need to double check. I just saw this cross my feed.
Meanwhile, it's been reported that Mark Warner, the Senate renegade who was supposedly trying to organize a meeting of some senators, has abandoned that plan. That's been reported. I don't know if it's true.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I saw a quote from Angus King asking whether Biden should be the Democratic nominee, and I think he said something like, "It's something we're discussing."
Mm-hmm.
So there's meetings, there's polls, and then there's going to be Biden's one more committed extemporaneous speaking engagement, and how that shakes out will probably go a long way to determine where we're going. I think that the one other wrinkle here that I doubt it's going to become a thing, but and I haven't looked into this closely myself, but a friend of mine, Daniel Schlossman, is a historian of political parties, and he, I believe, is writing an op-ed about the fact that the Democratic nomination rules, I believe that the language is something like, on the first round, the pledged delegates, have an obligation to vote the sentiment in the sentiment of their constituents, or the sentiment in their district states, whatever it is.
Right,
And
that's the way the mandate reads now, or
yeah,
he's
my understanding is that that's the actual language, and it's always been taken to mean you've got to vote as your constituents voted.
right.
But it's ambiguous enough that theoretically the delegates could argue that actually the sentiment now is that Biden shouldn't be the nominee. So he's making the argument that within the party's current bylaws that they actually could just deny Biden the
Well,
nomination, but that is a pretty minority opinion, I think, at this point.
one thing I wondered is, do the delegates know who each other are? Do they, and can they get in touch with one another? I mean, if they can network, you can imagine conversations that could start things moving. And if they don't, I guess one of them could stand up in public and say, "I'm a delegate. If you're one and you get in touch with me." But there's also the question of, like, how are these delegates selected? Did the Biden people manage to find people who have like a religious devotion to Joe Biden?
Right.
So there's just no way, because I think that's almost what it would take, to be very confident that the majority of his delegates would stick with him right now. Or is it the case that they basically just pick whoever the local party leaders say has been faithful to the party, because this has never been a problem before, right? They always vote for the delegate, the candidate they're pledged to. And if that's the case, I would think, and communication among the delegates is possible, I would think you can imagine a delegate revolt. It's a long shot, but I don't know.
Yeah, I really don't have a ton of insight into that. I do think one other wrinkle here is that I believe that there's like a roll call Zoom virtual nomination scheduled for like 9 days from now, which
Right.
the Democrats scheduled at a time when, at least the official rationale was that it looked like that Ohio had a ballot access law that was written such that waiting to formally nominate Biden until the convention would mean that he wouldn't be on the ballot in Ohio. The Ohio state legislature actually realized this mistake and fixed it. And now this meeting has no actual legal rationale, but Biden wants to keep it there because it's easier to run out the clock if they can get this done in 9 days.
And is it binding? Is it a binding vote from the point of view of the party?
Yeah.
So that's it.
So
the actual deadline is early August, not late August.
I think it's late July, if I'm not mistaken. But
the actual vote, because the Ohio deadline was early August, and you're saying the vote is scheduled for late July.
I think it's scheduled for sooner than that. I've got to double check on that. And I think that there's going to be, as that draws nearer, it's going to be a point of contention that it's foreseeable that maybe there might be some category of people who are not quite ready to say that Biden should drop out, but also would feel like, no, we shouldn't move things up just to nominate him so we have less time to see whether he holds up. That obviously only serves Biden and not the party. But I don't know. We'll see.
Yeah. Jim Clyburn had said that in principle, of course, he's basically supporting Biden, but he said in principle, this format, this virtual convention thing could be adapted to a non-Biden situation, and the delegates could choose that way. I mean, I've thought what would be good if Biden did drop out is have like basically a series of online straw polls that were kind of de facto the delegates deciding. Like, first, name anybody you want on the first round. the 3 top vote getters we vote for in the second round, then we vote for the 2 top vote getters, something like that. And just call it a straw poll, but it would open things up. Now, of course, if Biden drops out and says, Kamala's the ticket, I want all my delegates to vote for her, I guess that makes it pretty hard for the party to open things up. But it's getting harder to imagine him dropping out, period. But again, in a situation like this, whoever the person is going to be completely emphatic until the moment when they're not. So it's kind of hard to read the tea leaves on the basis of how he sounds about it.
Yeah, I think that's generally true. I think I'd say that I feel like it's possible. There's a world in which Biden is emphatic, but is not quite as much on the warpath as he has been. And specifically, I think the most telling thing to me was in the ABC News interview when he pretty strongly implicitly denigrated Kamala's fitness to run foreign affairs when he said, who else is going to keep NATO together?
Right.
Who else has that reach? Which I think would imply that the vice president does not have that reach.
Well, but see, I'm not even sure he realizes. Now, I have some criticisms of the way Stephanopoulos handled that interview. And one of them is exactly this, that was an opportunity for a challenging follow-up question. Biden said, who else can keep NATO together and do this and do that? And he mentioned 3 things. And in the context of the question, he had to be talking about other Democrats. But I'm not. And the follow-up question I would have liked to see is, wait a second, are you saying that none of these people who are being mentioned, Gavin Newsom, Gretchen Whitmer, Kamala Harris, can do these? Are you saying Kamala Harris, the woman you chose as vice president, is actually not qualified to be president? What are you saying here? Because see, I think what Biden was doing was reciting a talking point that he generally repeated in the context of the general election and kind of adapting it by saying, who else? But I mean, honestly, I want to get now next to this first comment of his in that interview that you highlighted, because looking at the debate performance, I just don't think his brain is working well enough that you can assume that he kind of consciously realized he was actually commenting about the Democratic candidates at that point.
Right. Yeah, no, that's possible. I mean, again, it really seems like, because that was the context of the comment, that he was talking about Democrats.
Oh, he had to be,
obviously,
substantively. That logically he had to be, but I almost don't know that he had made the connection in his brain.
Yeah, and obviously
it's not funny.
It's
I
like
feel
a
sorry
very
for him, but yeah,
counterproductive thing to do when I think one of the fallacies for those who are arguing that Biden, even in this state, is more electable than Harris is that precisely because Biden is in this condition, I think Harris's liabilities are built in, because I think there's a relatively widespread assumption that voting for Biden at this point makes Harris the president at some point in the next 4 years.
Okay, let's do run over this. It was his first extended answer, and you noted it right away on Twitter. You posted the clip, and I'll read it. It seems to me that it actually replicates kind of all of the problems we saw during the debate. But anyway, it's Stephanopoulos says, like, at what point did you know you're in trouble? He's asking about in the debate. Biden says, the whole way I prepared, nobody's fault but mine. I prepared what I usually would do, sitting down as I did come back with foreign leaders or National Security Council for explicit detail. And I realized about partway through that, I get quoted. The New York Times had me down at 10 points before the debate, 9 now, or whatever the hell it is. The fact of the matter is, what I looked at is that he also lied 28 times. The way the debate ran, not My fault. No one else's fault. No one else's fault. So that's, and then Stephanopoulos does kind of challenge him by saying, but but before I get to that, what is your? I see a number of troubling things going on here. What's the main one you called attention to?
Yeah, well, so because I was familiar with the White House's statements in the days after the debate, I understood the talking point that he was trying to articulate, which
Mhm.
was that the reason why he did so poorly in the debate was a case of over preparation, that he had approached this as though he were meeting with a foreign leader and trying to get fully versed in all the fine details of policy, and that this prevented him in the moment from just doing the broad strokes public communication that a debate requires because he just had too many facts on his brain. So
Right.
that's what he's like trying to say. But then he gets to, I realized partway through, and then he somehow forgets what it is he was supposed to have realized partway through, and then just seems to pivot to another talking point that he had
About Trump's
studied.
lies.
Yeah, I mean, first the New York Times polling, and I don't know if
Yeah, what is that? What is that? I mean, what is even that?
I
I get
couldn't.
quoted. The New York Times had me at 10 points before the debate, 9 now, or whatever the hell it is. That just comes out of the blue. He's suddenly talking about a polling result.
So I couldn't tell whether he moved from one talking point to a second, then immediately to a third, haphazardly, or whether he was trying to say, we've had all this coverage about, horse race bullshit. Oh, I was down 10 before, I'm down 9 now, whatever. Meanwhile, we're not talking about the substantive errors that Trump made and the lies that he told. I don't know if they're supposed to be part of the same point or if he's just bouncing around.
Yeah.
But yeah, it didn't. It was incoherent anyway, and completely unintelligible to a lay reader who wasn't familiar with the White House's pre-existing spin.
Yeah, and it seemed to combine his two worst things I thought during the debate were one where he lost his train of thought that time and just stumbled forever, and Trump wound up saying, "Yeah, you beat Medicare to death." And
Yeah,
then the other was when he dragged that immigration issue into the middle of a discussion on abortion. Somebody killed by an immigrant or something made no sense. It seems like
yeah,
he kind of did both of those things. I mean, he veered ultimately onto, he lost his train of thought and then he drags in, I don't know, and the other thing, look, I just don't want to be too hard on him. It is sad. We're all of us beyond a certain age are going downhill. I won't be doing public debates when I'm 81. I won't be doing podcasts when I'm 81. But this is really, I think, a matter of grave importance to the nation and the world. And so I'm going to be as mean as I think is in order. And the fact is, if you look at almost any segment of almost anything he says impromptu, it's not even a good version of coherent English. I mean, again, uh, you know, uh, the whole way I prepared, nobody's fault, mine. Nobody's fault but mine. Okay, so he corrects himself. I prepared what I usually would do, sitting down as I did, come back with foreign leaders or national security. I mean, this is not English.
and it reads
Eh,
like a bad Google translation before AI got better. Yeah,
right. And it's like this consistently. We've come to take it for it's kind of the way we've come to take a certain amount of crudeness of expression for granted with Trump. It's kind of the same thing. And now everybody just grades him on a curve. You kind of know what he means. But the difference is Trump hasn't gotten much worse since 4 years ago. Biden has gotten quite a bit worse since 4 years ago. He is on a clear downward trajectory, I think.
yeah, which I think is part of why I would expect, why I hope that there's actually potential for a Biden's replacement, even if it's Kamala Harris, who's not the most skilled politician in the world, simply by the standards of, you know, rhetorical skill that have been set by Trump and Biden.
Hmm.
Almost anybody in their prime age and soundness of mind is going to sound like a superstar. I mean,
Hmm.
I think that one effect of Biden's decay is that juxtapose Trump's statements against Biden, and it seems like he's like relatively coherent, but like objectively, he's also rambly, and he's also showing real signs of
Yeah.
decline. If you look at an interview from 2015 and then one today, it's pretty stark difference even with Trump. And then even starker, I think, if you look at like the 90s or the 2000s when he was partly it's
Yeah.
decline, partly it's that he was playing a different character then. He wanted more high society respectability, so he even had a different accent and whatever. But part of it is decline. And so, yeah, it's just you really, if Democrats could find the backbone to do what's right here, you would have a chance to flip the valence of the age issue and put Republicans on the defensive on it. But
And, I kind of wonder, should mainstream journalists be focusing more on this? I mean, they're definitely like the New York Times, of course, in general, in recent years, it's gone beyond the bounds of its old kind of conception of what reporting on the New York Times was, and has gotten more opinionated, not just analytical, but almost editorializing. And you've seen some of that coverage with this. But what you haven't seen is somebody treating his speech like review the Stephanopoulos interview the way you might review a State of the Union speech. You might do that. You might have somebody just assess the State of the Union speech as a piece of reporting. Like, why not do that and explain that, this is not better than the debate. I mean, this was just 22 minutes of not very challenging questions, and he performs like this. I mean, Gail Collins, in her little dialogue with Bret Stephens, I mean, she was hard on Biden, but she said about the Stephanopoulos interview, he certainly did prove he could have a discussion on TV without appearing to be a victim of senility. No, he didn't. He didn't. And maybe this, I don't know, maybe it wouldn't have any huge impact, but
yeah, I mean, I think a problem they're running into here is that the debate just set the bar on the floor,
right.
and there's no extemporaneous speaking environment that is as high pressure, stressful, and chaotic as a debate with Donald
That's
Trump.
right.
So you're going to expect him to do better than that in almost any appearance he does from here on. And if that's the standard, then, Democrats can say like, he's proven himself. But it's not a rational
Yeah.
standard.
Well, that's why I think we need these mainstream, organs to step in and do the fine grained analysis of what he's saying. But whatever. I also wish Stephanopoulos had asked. I mean, Stephanopoulos had a very tough job. And as far as that last follow-up question, I said I wish he had asked, look, I've had a million times where I thought in retrospect I should have asked a follow-up question. I don't want a Monday morning quarterback him on that. I do wish he'd at some point asked Biden he had taken an answer from the debate and said, like, what did you mean by this? Why did you bring an immigrant, some alleged murder by an immigrant or what, into a conversation? What were you thinking?
I do think I know what he was trying to do there.
Oh, good. I haven't heard a good explanation.
Which is an example of, I think, them giving him way too advanced an assignment for a remedial speaker. I believe what he was trying to say was that, Donald Trump, you try to get political gain out of, hyping up these acts of sexual violence by an immigrant against an American woman, and yet you're the one who would prevent that woman from having an abortion. How much do you actually care about victims of sexual violence? You're just being cynical about it. I think that's what he was trying to say, or at least that's what his aides were.
It would have been interesting to see if he could have said that in the Stephanopoulos interview on reflection. So when he said he went to the funeral, did Trump go to the funeral of somebody who was supposedly killed by an immigrant? Who is the he? Do we know?
I assumed so, but I didn't look into that.
I mean, I asked Mickey Kaus, and by email, and even he wasn't aware of such a case. And God knows if Mickey wasn't, I don't know. Anyway, so kind of sociologically, in terms of what Democrats are still standing behind Biden, is there any pattern here? Like you've got Josh Marshall, right, among journalists. I guess you've got Whoopi Goldberg and Stephen Colbert among entertainers. Have you noticed any kind of ideological or demographic pattern behind who is and isn't standing with Biden?
It's not consistent ideologically. It's not universal generationally, but there has definitely been a little bit of 70 something senior congressional Democrats being averse to affirming the argument that an older person can never lose their God-given right to whatever position they currently hold just because they are not competent anymore. So there's been a little bit of that. I think there's a generational divide. The other thing, which perhaps on some level would be curious, is that the Congressional Black Caucus has been a real pillar of support for Biden. And I just saw that that caucus has been invited to, I think, a virtual meeting with Biden tonight or something. It sounds a little bit odd on one level in terms of like the most likely outcome if Biden steps aside is a African-American nominee in Kamala Harris, who I think some in the Black Caucus originally fought to have on the ticket. But nevertheless, I don't know exactly how to explain it, whether it's a pro-institutional bias or what it is, but that's been a major source of strength for him to this point.
Yeah. But it seems like, I mean, it's hard to say because, your Twitter feed is not a random, and I try to go back and forth between people I'm following and the For You and the, I don't know, but I can't get a random sampling of kind of elite opinion. But one thing that it does seem to be the case is that there's a lot of people who want him to step down who are like really, really pissed that he's not. It's almost like a kind of populist revolt, except that this isn't really the grassroots I'm hearing from. It's like a populist elite revolt. And I wonder if that's going to have like enduring consequences, especially if he stays on the ticket and leads the Democrats into complete disaster. If that's going to lead to some kind of reckoning, maybe even a change in the way delegates are selected. There are a lot of people saying, look, we'd be better off if there was more influence from the smoke-filled rooms of yesteryear, with elites. But what is your take on, like, you recognize what I'm saying? There's a lot of people, it's almost like they're ready for a revolution.
Yeah, so I think there is a tremendous amount of anger. It's not universal, but a lot of anger among liberal pundits, Democratic activists, and donors who feel, one, like we've been lied to and systematically misled, and in a way that is a little bit humiliating for those who, consistently mocked Republicans who did, I think, in many cases, and even with what we've seen, some exaggerated. I don't think that Biden is straight up demented, and it would be much easier if he were. Nevertheless, dismissed the Robert Hur report, dismissed Republican arguments about Biden's age, on the grounds like Trump's just 3 years younger and Trump doesn't make any sense. He's incoherent. When clearly that's true, but there is a difference between where the two of them are at. So there's a little bit of just, a sense that, that we've been lied to, especially with the leaks that have come out since then about how he's been having these moments for a while. And it's not a coincidence that he didn't do the Super Bowl interview and that he's had fewer press conferences than any previous president in the modern era. There's also, now just, I'm growing increasingly angry. It's just what's happening right now is just so irresponsible, and it's bringing out a side of Biden that has always been there, but it was not the dominant note in his public appearance, which is, relatively universal trait among people who want to be president, but a raging egotism and ambition that is superseding, Joe, the empathetic guy who has suffered tremendously and is therefore able to identify with the suffering, guy who's just really committed to liberal democracy and the Democratic Party, who has always had a soft spot for labor. These sort of aspects of his political persona are being eclipsed by just this raw and deeply misplaced at this point ambition. And it's just coming on the heels of years of rhetoric about Trump being an existential threat to the country. It is off-putting that he's staying in the race and that he's saying things like, I'll feel okay as long as I gave it my best shot, or, whatever. So there's anger about that. And then what you were referring to, I think, beyond Biden, I think there is increasingly anger at the Democratic Party, at the lawmakers who have come out and voiced support for Biden, and as well as the Biden's own inner circle and that whole group of people who have, again, are perhaps the most complicit in deceiving the public. And I think a lot of people are irked by those people and the Democratic endorsers of Biden saying, like, hey, he was the voters' pick and we need to listen to the voters, after systematically deceiving the voters about what Biden's mental condition was in. So I think that there's a lot of anger. I think the implications of that are difficult to say. The troubling thing at this point, or the difficult, disorienting thing, is that from this moment today, I think that right now I'm having a little bit of trouble seeing Biden getting forced out, absent a total faceplant at this press conference. But I'm also having trouble seeing him staying on. It just seems so totally untenable. So at some point, if he does ride this out, there's going to be a point where it's like, okay, he is the nominee formally. We've all got to get back on side and pivot to making the case for Biden's election. And I think a lot of people are going to find that really difficult to do, given that there is also, I think right now, it's hard for me to know. I think Biden can be president. I think he has good days and bad days, and he has advisors around him, and there isn't a ton of evidence of him making, he's made bad policy decisions in my view, but making decisions that are just like, this guy must be like loopy.
Yeah, no, Trump did more of those. Like Trump, deciding to assassinate some guy in Iraq suddenly, who and almost start a war with Iran. No, Trump still worries me more in that way.
Right. But as far as am I confident that Biden will be fit to be president in 2028? Obviously not.
Right.
And so anyway, I think that's going to undermine advocacy for him in the coming months, which is one of many reasons why I think Democrats would be better off with a different candidate. In terms of after the election, assuming he loses, I feel like it's a little bit harder to game out what that does, because the ideological valence of pro-Biden, anti-Biden is so unclear. But I think you're going to see generally just a lot of disillusionment with anybody in a leadership position in the Democratic Party. The higher up you are in the party, the more culpability you have in its decisions, including a decision, if it goes out this way, for the leaders of the Senate and House not to come out publicly for a new candidate. And so those people are going to, I think maybe they think it's lower risk for them not to stick their necks out and tell Biden to go. But I think there's going to be considerable risk to them in a world where we all where they lead the party, towards this, just march them into the ocean, towards this very predictable, catastrophic end. So
Yeah, but I mean, as you kind of suggested earlier, their concern is that if they do go public, Schumer, assuming he's inclined to, and so on, if all these leaders do go public and Biden just sticks it out, then the Democrats as a whole will perform even worse than they would have if these guys hadn't said anything. Because obviously, if all of the party leaders have said this guy is not qualified to be president, then, I would imagine the whole party's going to do pretty badly. It's
yeah, I mean,
it's a mess.
I think that might be the fear. I don't think it is. I think that it's just so overwhelmingly likely that if you had Schumer and Jeffries and large majorities of the Democratic congressional caucuses come out and publicly say that Biden needs to step down, I don't think it would take a really bizarre personality to be able to withstand that just on a human level, and continue to be the nominee of a party that has rejected you in that manner. I also think at that point we're in such a bizarre situation that the interpreting what it means to vote with the sentiment of your constituents becomes thinkable. So I don't know. I mean, on the one hand, technically, formally speaking, this is Biden's decision and only Biden's decision. I really don't believe, though, if Chuck Schumer and Hakeem Jeffries and everybody get in front of microphones and say that, like, we feel a duty to the country that, that Biden needs to step down because he's not going to be, we're concerned he's not going to be able to serve in 4 years. Like, at that point, I don't know. It's just like it's certain defeat for Biden if he stays on.
The way to do it would be, of course, to first approach him privately. A group of people. It wouldn't have to be Schumer. If you even took all of the people who are reported to have said on that Sunday conference call that they oppose, those were some big names in the House, and you pick a number of big name senators, not necessarily including Schumer, but if a fair number of people got together and credibly said to him, look, we're going to go public tomorrow, okay? And it's going to get super ugly, but we have sworn to one another we're going to do it. And we encourage you to take the graceful way out and say you've reconsidered. I mean, that's the game theoretical way to do it, is give him a way to save face and credibly threaten the nuclear destruction of the entire planet. I don't imagine that happening. But the sad thing is that the main reason I don't imagine it happening is just not because everybody's really thought it through and really thought the stakes through, but just like the part of human nature that discourages us all from being courageous, all the time. We've all felt it. Yep. We've all chickened out, and I think that's the biggest obstacle. I mean, when you really think through, what would the implications be? Or if just one person stood up, if Chris Murphy just stood up, he did get a little edgy in an interview on Sunday. But if if a few of these people just stood up and said, look, how much enduring damage, I mean, would that be fatal to their political careers or something? I mean, I don't know. I mean, it might. Murphy's up for re-election this year.
Stood up, and you're seeing the most vulnerable Senate Democrats, Sherrod Brown and John Tester, have walked right up to the line of calling for Biden to step down. Brown said something today about how he's talking to voters out in Ohio and they have legitimate concerns, and they're getting closer to saying it. So individual people are going to, and if Biden stays on by November, so many of these down ballot Democrats are going to be trying to put as much distance between themselves and Biden as possible, that the numbers, ironically, possibly after he is irrevocably the nominee, the number who call for him not to be the nominee or denigrate his capacity could go up. But yeah, I think it is. I do think that if you had a rising superstar in the party as vice president, a world where Barack Obama is the vice president, or even Gretchen Whitmer or whatever, I think that it would be easier for some to find the courage. I think a big obstacle here is doing something against one's nature, courageous, risky, for the sake of elevating a politician you don't really believe in either. So I think that's part of the conundrum. I mean, I think the origin, I do think that a lot of the issue here, and again, I think that Harris would be a better candidate than Biden and could potentially win. I think that a lot of our problem here goes back to that vice presidential choice, which was made at a time when Harris's liabilities as a politician were already evident. And I think it is the widespread distrust in her that enabled the party to talk itself into renominating an 81-year-old to begin with, which is an inherently kind of absurd thing to do. And
yeah, so we're getting into an area that I want to talk about further. How bad would Kamala be? Who's the ideal running mate? What's your dream ticket, assuming they could turn it into some kind of open convention or open virtual convention? However, we've reached the end of the public part of the podcast. Now we're about to go into overtime. This will be accessible to everyone who is a paid subscriber to the Nonzero newsletter, which we encourage everyone to become. Just go to Nonzero at Substack, sign up, and then there will be a post where all of this resides. First of all, you can listen right away, but also you can set up a podcast feed that'll entitle you to always listen to the overtime segments. Before we go into overtime, Eric, is there anything you want to say by way of, well, either clarification of anything you've said or by way of self-promotion? Like, obviously, people should go to Vox and look for your stuff. Your Twitter handle, is it just Eric Levitz, or does it have a middle initial? What is your Twitter handle?
No, yeah, it's just my first and last name. It's Eric with a C, EricLevitz. And yeah, you can find me there on Twitter, and yeah, at Vox as well. If you are already familiar with my work and Vox's work and like it, we also recently started a membership program. All of media is having a little trouble with relying on ad dollars alone, and so with that subscription, sort of similar to a Substack to an extent, except all of our stuff is unpaywalled, but there's bonus content and member benefits like Q&As with me and other writers that you can get if you chip in $5 or more a month.
And I really recommend that people read your stuff. It's consistently reasonable. Sometimes I disagree, but it's always well argued in a way that I think is kind of rare, to an extent that I think is kind of rare. It's fundamentally rational. So thanks to everybody who stuck with us this far, and to those who are going to follow us into overtime. And here we go into overtime.